This is topic 8.2, Resource Use in Society for IB ESS. So we're going to talk about today various resources. We've talked in the past about natural capital and natural income. Natural capital being, resources, things that you can get your hands on. And natural income is how you can process those things into other products or services, some sort of equity that you can use. For example, a forest might have trees, obviously, as natural capital, and then they could be processed into lumber, and that would be your natural income. So what we're interested in doing today is not just looking at natural capital, but how quickly we can renew those, and if they're sustainable, therefore. So there's three categories here. One is renewable natural capital, one is replenishable, and the other is non-renewable. I know they kind of sound similar, and the definitions are a little vague, but I'm just going to break it down really easily. If something can be very, very quickly restored, we would call it renewable. If it takes a little bit of time, it's a little slower, we would call it replenishable. And if it's almost impossible to restore, certainly in many lifetimes, we would call it non-renewable. So think about this as simply the speed at which you can replace it. And I know that's an arbitrary, subjective definition, but that's what we're going to try and decide here. So in renewable, basically things that are living, that do photosynthesis, those would be considered to be things that are renewable. So I talked before about my example of timber from trees. That's something which is living. Maybe it takes 20 years or so for a generation of trees to renew, but that still falls under this category. So anything which is photosynthesis, plants and so forth, cattle, anything which is living, which can grow, would be renewable pretty quickly. We would also consider in a more abstract sense those sources of energy. So, for example, solar radiation or wind would be things that are renewable. Water power would be renewable. Then we go into a middle ground here where it takes a longer time, and we have to be a little more careful about these sort of things. So an example they typically give is like groundwater. Now I know what you're thinking, water, but it's not really the same thing as water power, of water just rushing down the river. So let's suppose that the United States is drawing water from the ground, from aquifers. We can use it up pretty quickly, but it actually takes a fair amount of time to filter water back into the ground and to be stored there. So we're using it at a much, much faster rate than it can really be replenished. So that would be considered not a renewable resource, but one which is replenishable. And then we go way over here to things which are non-renewable, things that really take a long, long time to get back. Fossil fuels would be a great example here. Minerals, so uranium, for example, for nuclear power plants. Even though we think about nuclear power plants as being renewable, the uranium itself could take a long, long time. So what we're trying to do here basically is move our society to being more sustainable by using renewable or replenishable resources here. Living with the means of nature, that would be basically the idea of sustainability. So I talked a moment ago about over-extraction of groundwater, which is a big problem in the United States right now. Not particularly where we're living in the Northwest, but in other parts of the country. Because groundwater takes a longer time. It is a renewable, but not replenishable. Another example would be lumber, which I've talked about before. That would be an easily renewable quantity. Generation is pretty much 20 years, not too bad. So I often think about harvesting trees really as almost growing corn. It's really just a crop. Types of ecosystem services. So supporting services are essential for life as primary productivity, soil formation, and nutrient recycling. We also need the regulating services, provisioning services, and cultural services. So in order to maintain the sustainability, we need to have indirect or associated services. Now, when we started off this course, way back in topic 1, we talked about how do you place value on something, and it has to do with your environmental value system. Different people place different values on things. For example, we have different ecological value on a forest. Some of us think about it in terms of ethical standards. Some of us think about it in terms of biological standards. And some of us think about it simply in a monetary value. What sort of natural income can I get from the natural capital of the trees? It all depends on your EVS. And based on those things, based on how we convert natural capital into natural income, that determines our ecological footprint. I'd like you to know the definition here. Ecological footprint, the method to measure human demand on natural capital. And it depends on how we look at things and the services we will assign. Okay, let's take a look at ecological value. So how can we break down natural capital into a monetary or a value system? Depends how we look at the resources, how we use it. Do we use it directly? Do we use it indirectly? So here is a sort of an abstract rubric for how we would take the economic value of something and assign a monetary value. Do we use it directly? Do we use it indirectly? Is it something I can hold on to and sell to somebody later on? Or does it simply have an existential value? For example, the forest. The forest has an existential value because I want it to be there for my children. Now, the more we move from this side over here, direct use, to an existential value here, it becomes harder and harder to put a price on it. So if I'm talking about a forest, for example, a direct use, yeah, I could cut down the trees and make lumber and sell the lumber. It's very easy for me to put a value on that lumber. But if I go all the way to the right here and say, I simply want it to be a habitat so I can have biodiversity in the area for all the animals there, that's harder for me to actually put a monetary value on it. Let's take a look at the different ways we could break things up, and then we'll go ahead and use an example. So over here, direct. Now that means we can easily put a value on it because we're using it. Are we using it? Are we consuming it? Even if we're not consuming it, if we're giving it to somebody else, or if we're using it for something indirectly, that would be non-consumptive. Indirect value means not something you get from the material, but a service which is related to it. So if I'm sticking with the trees, for example, I might have lumber. That's a direct use value. An indirect use value might be that it creates shade so that something else can grow in the area. Indirect means we get a service from it. Let us suppose in the forest there, hikers get to use it because it creates a nice environment for them to walk through with their families. Now, option means contractual. So in other words, I can put a value on paper on that forest, and then I can sell it to somebody else. This land may be worth something. Maybe somebody's going to build a house on it. I don't know. And then existential simply means something that's very difficult to put a value on it, and is by my EVS has a value because, I think that the forest has an ethical reason for being there. It's a habitat for other animals and plants. It's something I can pass on to my children. So let's go ahead and do an example. That always makes it a little easier. Let's try the forest here and break it on down. Now again, remember, on the left side, it's easy to put a monetary value. On the right side, it's difficult. So let's start off on the left side. So a forest, it has timber. I can use that lumber to build houses. That is a direct use. I am consuming it. So timber. Now, direct use, non-consumptive. A direct use here is people can go out there and camp because there's all these trees which has created this nice environment. I'm directly using it, but I'm not consuming it. Now, and we can charge people, right? So the National Forest Service charges people a certain fee to go camping there. Let's move over here. Indirect use. Water filtration. So water in the area there has to be filtered, and the forest goes ahead and cleans up water, and then I can go ahead. So if you've ever been camping, you typically know, not a lake, but in rivers, the water coming down there tastes so good, it's so clean. And that was an indirect bonus I got for going to the forest. Now let's go over here to option use. Let us suppose that forests I discovered had all sorts of minerals down below. I don't know what minerals it would have. Coal, let's say, is down below there. Maybe there's copper, maybe there's quartz. I could go ahead and sell that land then based on the mineral rights. And it's easy for me to put a value on that. It's not going to be used right away, but maybe in the future it would be. And finally, the existential value. It's a wilderness area, as I said. It creates biodiversity. Unfortunately, even though we're able to decide which category and what value they have, values change over time. Let's look at uranium. So we said uranium was a non-renewable resource. That's true. And as we use more and more of it up, since it is a non-renewable resource, it becomes even more valuable. Same thing is going on with oil. That's why the price of oil goes up. As we use more, there are less reserves to draw on. On the other hand, some things become outdated. For example, flint used to be used all the time for guns. It's not, because other metal ores have been extracted. Flint is now worth very, very little.